France occupied Vietnam for many years, but was eventually pushed out of the country by Vietnamese insurgents. President Eisenhower promised to help South Vietnam against the communist government of North Vietnam. Ho Chi Minh was the leader of North Vietnam, and he led a communist government, and Eisenhower was a strong believer in the domino theory, so he pledged aid to South Korea, and that's how U.S. first got involved in Vietnam. JFK kept that promise by further involving the U.S. in Vietnam with a coup in South Vietnam. When President Kennedy was assassinated and LBJ was sworn into office, he inherited a very unstable situation in Vietnam. Many people wanted to get involved in order to stop the spread of communism, so Johnson twisted Congress's arm by sending an American warship only 5 miles off the coast of North Vietnam, when North Vietnam specifically told them not to do so. When the ship was attacked by North Vietnamese patrol boats, Johnson asked Congress to pass the Tonkin Gulf Resolution, which gave Johnson full freedom to act in Vietnam. Finally, in 1965, the first American troops arrived in Vietnam. Small amounts were sent at a time, but the total number of Americans in Vietnam at one time was over 500,000. The Vietnam War was started with a vast majority of Americans supporting it. Yet as the war progressed and the years sped by with little tangible progress, it became an extremely controversial war. Another controversial thing about this war was the draft system. At the beginning of the war, many of the casualties in Vietnam were African Americans, because African Americans were drafted at a much higher rate than whites, because blacks often couldn't afford to go to college, thus couldn't get exemptions from the draft. This caused an uproar in the black community. Also, most of the soldiers that were sent to Vietnam were in lower classes. Anyone who was enrolled in college didn't get drafted into the military, thus minorities were the main groups forced to fight in Vietnam. America used weapons that were not legal to use because of the extreme damage they did to the people of Vietnam, causing horrific birth defects for many generations, as well as cancer among thousands of Vietnamese people. These weapons included Agent Orange, which is used as a defoliant on trees in Vietnam, and napalm, which is a firebomb when exploded. The soldiers knew these weapons were illegal to use. However, they were offered by superior officers to use these illegal weapons. Illegal chemical warfare lowered soldier morale, and in combination with the fact that the majority of soldiers thought they were fighting a completely meaningless war, caused the troops' morale to go very low. Also, soldiers hated living in the jungle and raiding and burning innocent villagers and their entire village. Thus, soldiers had extremely low morale and no desire to fight because they had no purpose. Therefore, widespread protests began nationwide, starting with marches, burning draft cards, and even immolation. Moreover, a very common form of protest within the nation was through music. Musicians voiced their opinions through lyrics. At this point in history, music was now capable of being widely spread throughout the country and could get widespread popularity and fame. Thus, musicians could affect a large audience through music.
The song Blowin' in the Wind by Bob Dylan is an anti-war song written for the Vietnam War. Many different artists have made covers to the song. Dylan wrote Blowin' in the Wind in 1962, and it exemplifies the passive nature of the protest at this time. 1962, when the song was written, was before America became involved in Vietnam. Yet the song was so applicable to the anti-war protest movement that it is considered a protest movement song. Since it was released, Blowin' in the Wind has been covered by more than 100 artists, the majority being during the mid to late 60s. The war had not yet gotten to the
extremes of chemical warfare and mass casualties, so the protest was not as severe as it was in a later decade. Therefore, Dylan's song is a mild deception of the disagreement with the Vietnam War. It doesn't have the upfront and angry message that later Vietnam War songs have. The song was a very passive and whimsical feel, which is a product of its time because extreme dissent for a war had not begun yet. Rather, the government was starting to lose support for the war. The title Blowin' in the Wind is an example of how the song is a passive one and it just flows with nature. It asks how long the violence will continue. Bob Dylan writes, "How many times must the cannonballs fly before they're banned forever?" Dylan believes that the U.S. has indicted too many wars and they no longer have a meaningful direction. Dylan makes it clear that the people want the violence to end when he sings, "How many times can a man turn his head pretending he doesn't see?" Therefore, Dylan is a very upfront
about the fact that most Americans dissent the invasion of Vietnam, but they lack the desire and ability to actually make a change. Dylan requests that Americans protest the Vietnam War. He knows that the populace disagrees with the war, but he thinks it's time for American citizens to stop being passive and elicit change. John Lennon's Give Peace a Chance is an upfront anti-war song written in the latter stages of the Vietnam War. As opposed to the passive and whimsical nature of the song Blowin' in the Wind, this song contains extremely candid and direct messages protesting the war, which exemplifies the growing discontent about the war in 1969, which is when the song was released. Lennon writes, "This ism, that ism, ism, to express the constant power struggle between the capitalist nations of the West and the communist nations of the East, and how it really doesn't warrant a full-scale war." Lennon is noting that it is nothing more than a difference in thought and how it has gotten way out of hand. Furthermore, it is certainly not worth sending soldiers to death and using chemical warfare on innocent civilians just to try to eliminate an alternate economic system in the world. Also, Lennon goes on to sing, "Everybody's talking about revolution, evolution," because it seems that the U.S. government is very involved in the politics of small countries. Vietnam has no significant military or economic value to the United States, yet the government of the United States is very involved in their revolution because they desperately want to get rid of communism. Lennon is commenting on the over-involvement of the United States in small countries' affairs and how it is a waste of resources that would be far better spent within the U.S. Finally, the song's title, Give Peace a Chance, really is the central theme of the song and a very direct message. Lennon implores the United States government to try giving peace a chance, instead of always immediately resorting to war. He wants the government to at least think about peace as a viable course of action. Lennon argues that the war is one of little importance and peace is the best option. He just wants the American government to give it a shot. Vietnam became an extremely unpopular war by the mid-1960s, and there were tons of acts of protests, yet they were often uncoordinated. Music was a way to unite the feelings of protesters across the entire country, so people were more organized. The increasing organization made the protest movement a far more effective one in effecting change in the government. Therefore, music was a huge part of getting the troops out of Vietnam, the ultimate goal of all anti-war protests, and without the music, the protesters would have lacked the unity and organization to make legitimate change.